Welcome to this explainer. It's Monday, August 24th, 2026, and wow, the global shipping industry has just woken up to an absolute nightmare. Today, we're going to walk step by step through a critical, real-time legal breakdown of this developing tanker crisis in the Middle East. We are looking at a situation that literally threatens to choke off the world's energy supply, stall billions of dollars in cargo, and send global markets into a complete tailspin. If you manage, charter, insure, or own a vessel that relies on Middle Eastern trade routes, the situation on the ground right now is incredibly tense, and you need concrete answers immediately. Okay, let's dive into this. This is the single most important question keeping ship operations managers wide awake tonight. Can Iran legally seize your tanker right now? Operators are suddenly facing a terrifying dual threat. On one side, you've got the immediate risk of physical interdiction by Iranian naval forces if you don't comply with their brand new, completely unilateral transit rules. But on the flip side, complying with those demands might expose you to devastating secondary sanctions from the U.S. Treasury. We're talking about your company being completely cut off from the U.S. dollar and global banking. It's a genuine, absolute rock-and-a-hard-place scenario. To really wrap our heads around the scale of what just happened, just consider the number 45. As of this morning, roughly 45 commercial tankers have been officially blacklisted by Iran's newly empowered Persian Gulf Strait Authority. And look, we aren't just talking about some unknown phantom fleet operating in the shadows. This list includes blue-chip, mainstream ships linked to major players like ADNOC, Bahri, and Klaveness. By targeting the establishment, a massive target has basically been painted on the back of the entire industry.
And the global stakes? They literally couldn't be higher. Check this out. Even in a depressed traffic environment, a massive 20%, that is 1/5 of all global oil and liquefied natural gas, moves straight through this exact choke point. Because there are no viable pipeline alternatives for this sheer volume of energy, any friction here doesn't just impact the ships involved. It instantly ripples out like a shockwave to global energy prices, inflation, and international security.
So, here's our roadmap for how we'll untangle this crisis systematically. First, the 2026 crisis itself. Second, the international law framework. Third, Iran's claims versus global law. Fourth, the enforcement and sanctions risks. And finally, we'll give you practical steps for operators out on the water today. All right, Part 1, the 2026 Hormuz tanker crisis. Let's establish exactly what threats maritime operators are actually facing right now. The Persian Gulf Strait Authority hasn't just published a list of names, they have issued some severe, highly specific ultimatums. These threats include massive fines, physical detention of the vessel, and even outright cargo confiscation for violating their unilateral transit rules. But here's the absolute most dangerous part for the broader industry. Liability now acts like a virus, extending to any ship-to-ship transfers. If a perfectly clean ship conducts a transfer with a listed vessel anywhere in the region, Iran claims the right to penalize them too. This cross-contamination risk is forcing insurers and operators to scramble, rewriting risk premiums and voyage instructions in real time just to cope.
Let's move to Part 2, the international law framework. We desperately need a clear legal baseline to rely on here, rather than just getting swept up in geopolitical alarmism.
The absolute bedrock of our legal baseline is the concept of transit passage. This is defined as the right of continuous and expeditious transit between one part of the high seas or exclusive economic zone and another, which coastal states cannot lawfully hamper or suspend. So, the crucial point here is that transit passage is uniquely powerful. Unlike innocent passage, where coastal states actually have quite a bit of leeway to judge if a ship is acting aggressively, transit passage guarantees absolute, non-suspendable movement, provided the ship just keeps moving. Sure, it's not open ocean, but it is certainly not a coastal state's private toll road either. Now, Iran and the U.S. often point out that neither of them are signatories to the 1982 UN-Clause Treaty, but historically, that doesn't actually matter. Look at this timeline. Back in 1949, the International Court of Justice's Corfu Channel judgment recognized the right of passage without prior authorization. By 1958, the Convention on the Territorial Sea strictly prohibited the suspension of innocent passage in these straits. And finally, in 1982, UN clause formally codified transit passage. This timeline brilliantly illustrates a massive legal reality. These rules are deeply binding as customary international law. Because the vast majority of nations have universally practiced and accepted these rules for decades, they become the default law of the sea. Neither Washington nor Tehran can simply opt out of a global consensus. Let's look exactly at how customary law limits coastal state authority here. Under Article 38 of UN Clause, all ships enjoy the right of transit passage. Article 44 then places a strict duty on coastal states not to hamper or suspend that passage. So what can they do? Well, under Articles 41 and 42, coastal states are allowed to adopt navigational safety laws, things like traffic separation schemes, but only via the International Maritime Organization. Furthermore, these laws absolutely must be non-discriminatory. They cannot be used as a geopolitical backdoor to block specific flags or companies. This brings us to Part 3, Iran claims versus global law. Let's analyze how Iran actually justifies these new rules and how the international legal consensus responds. One of the biggest points of friction right now is the demand for fees. Under established global law, permitted charges are strictly for specific, tangible services that are actually rendered to the ship, like pilotage or emergency towing. What is absolutely prohibited are general transit fees, arbitrary security shakedowns, or any permit fee scaled to the value of your cargo. Simply put, charging for a real, invoiced service is perfectly fine. Monetizing the fundamental right to transit in international strait is completely illegal. Let's break down the core arguments completely impartially. On one hand, Iran asserts that because the shipping lanes physically pass through its 12 nautical mile territorial sea, it has absolute sovereign rights to regulate them for national security. However, the global law counteranalysis is incredibly firm. The legal regime of international straits supersedes standard territorial sea rules. Domestic security concerns simply cannot extinguish a third state vessel's right to continuous transit. Furthermore, any bilateral geopolitical maneuvering between the US and Iran cannot legally bind commercial vessels from third-party nations. So, the resulting legal consensus is very clear. Creating a discriminatory blacklist and threatening ships with confiscation for non-compliance with unilateral rules is fundamentally unlawful under customary international law. Which leads us to Part 4, Enforcement and Sanctions Risks. Because, let's be real, being legally right doesn't magically keep a ship safe. We have to pivot from legal theory to the harsh commercial reality. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is it exposes the massive gap between the classroom and the high seas. The legal right is undeniable. Foreign commercial vessels have uninterrupted transit passage. But having a legal right does not magically create a force field around your ship. Iranian naval forces still possess the physical capability, the fast attack craft, the helicopters, to board, delay, or seize vessels outright. And if that happens, trying to recover your ship and crew through courts or diplomacy is an agonizingly slow, highly uncertain process. And if physical seizure wasn't enough of a headache, operators are facing a massive parallel threat. Today, the U.S. Treasury is signaling what they're calling the single greatest financial offensive ever against Iran. Think about what this means. If an operator decides to quietly just pay an Iranian security fee to ensure safe physical passage, they risk triggering U.S. secondary sanctions. The U.S. Treasury's OFAC can blacklist that shipping company, instantly cutting them off from U.S. dollar clearing, Western insurance markets, and global banking. For most operators, this financial death sentence is actually a much tighter constraint than the threat of physical interdiction itself. Finally, Part 5, Practical Steps. Here is your concrete action plan for navigating this crisis over the next 24 hours. We've distilled this into a practical 4-step checklist. Step 1. Immediately check the published blacklist. Ensure neither your ship nor any planned STS partners are on it. And right away, notify your P&I club in writing to preserve your insurance cover. Step 2. Meticulously document every single communication with Iranian authorities. Step 3. Be prepared to reroute. Honestly, if the combined risk of losing your insurance or facing U.S. sanctions outweighs your legal right to transit, stop the ship. And Step 4. Review your charter party war risk and deviation clauses immediately, because the second a vessel's delayed, a fierce legal battle over who pays for that lost time is going to kick off. Digging just a bit deeper into those defensive steps, if you are held by authorities, be professional, of course, but do not volunteer information that implies you accept their unilateral regulatory jurisdiction. If you do proceed through the strait, maintain continuous AIS transmission wherever it's safe to do so. Going dark only creates suspicion. Keep exhaustive minute-by-minute bridge records of your transit to prove you didn't deviate from normal passage. Coordinate actively with any available naval escorts or coalition reporting centers. Ultimately, your vessel's verifiable communication and AIS records, backed up by swift coordination with your flag state and P&I club, are absolutely your strongest line of defense in the event of an incident. We'll wrap up this explainer with this indispensable summary, right here on the screen. Act on the law, price the risk, and document everything.
International law unequivocally guarantees your right to transit the Strait of Hormuz. But U.S. sanctions and Iranian boarding parties are very real, very dangerous commercial realities. Please share this framework with your legal and operations teams immediately to assess your current voyage instructions. Because as global trade hangs in the balance, you really have to ask yourselves, if your vessel is hailed in the dead of night by a fast attack craft, is your crew truly prepared to defend your legal rights without accidentally triggering a financial death sentence?